All right. Thanks to all for being here, for bearing with my lateness, and for adjusting to Tuesday night at 8:45. We finally made it to Parshat Beha'alotcha. They're already in Parshat Shlach in Israel. This is one of my favorite parshiot, just the breadth of topics that are covered, the narratives, the legal sections, and this moment of transition between the sort of idealized state of Bnei Israel in their encampment and the vision of their journeys, and and the real life realities as they embark on their way. Um, I think it's just a great parsha. And Rabbi Foreman, in a shorter essay, relatively speaking, and continuing, it seems to me, um, in this book, as we've been reading in Beha'alotcha, much in Bamidbar, much more than in Vayikra, it feels like the source references are more scant, although it continues to be grounded in textual analysis, but it's more of his voice and less of the Torah's text voices. And really here he's trying to develop one point out of just a few psukim and connections. Um, and I think he does so compellingly and uses text from our parasha to develop an idea, which is, um, I think, one that rings very true for me about humility. And so we'll jump right in. It's not as long. Hopefully, we'll get everybody out before it's too very late tonight. The title is What is Humility Made of? And he begins in Parshat Beha'alotcha, we get a clue to understanding two abiding mysteries about Moshe. Each concerns a way in which the Torah speaks of Moshe as standing apart, seemingly, from all other human beings. Mystery number one, Moshe experiences the revelation of God at Sinai in a way that no one else did, or seemingly even could. He is atop the mountain upon which the Master of the universe descends, while all others were warned that even touching the mountain would be fatal. Apparently, the human body was not made to withstand direct contact with God or divine environs, and yet Moshe successfully encounters God speaking with the Master of the universe face to face. Why? What was different about him? Whatever the answer to that question is, intriguingly, there is yet another way that Moshe stands apart from all other people. This other unique aspect of Moshe concerns a character trait of his, a trait he possesses, according to the text of the Torah, in the extreme. The Torah speaks of Moshe as having been the most humble of all human beings. The source reference here is to the end of our Parashah. And yet, here we come to our second mystery. We tend to associate humility with being respectful, perhaps even submissive, meek, or self-effacing. These, at least, are the synonyms your average dictionary gives for humble. The question is, does this description fit Moses? Sorry, hold on. My computer's popping up windows. There we go. Well, let's look at his record. Over the course of his life, one of the most consistent patterns that emerges in Moshe's behavior is his willingness to challenge the powerful in defense of the weak. Indeed, he does so in increasingly intense increments. Beginning of the book of Shemot, we've seen this, I think, with Rabbi Shai Held, maybe, and maybe even in another um, Parsha essay. First, he challenges ordinary, powerful individuals. The Egyptian taskmaster menacing a Hebrew slave, then one Hebrew slave who's threatening another. After that, he challenges a whole group of people, the Midianite shepherds harassing the daughters of Yitro. After that, standing in defense of his people, he confronts Paro himself, the ruler of the mightiest civilization the world had ever known. And that's not all. At some point after this, Moshe challenges the ultimate authority, the master of the universe, God's self. In the aftermath of the golden calf episode, God stands ready to destroy the entire people and start over with Moshe. But Moshe will have none of it. With what can only be described as icy determination, he provides God with a choice. And now we're quoting from Exodus chapter 32. Moshe went back to God and said, Oh, this people has committed a terrible sin. They have made themselves gods of gold. And now, if you will bear their sin, and in brackets he explains, and forgive them, fine. But if not, and in brackets he explains, don't think you can start over with me. I'm not going along with that. If you fail to forgive them, just, now we come back to the literal translation of the words of the Torah. If not, erase me from your book that you have written. Imayin mecheni na misifrecha asher katavta. Moshe might be described as humble, but doesn't his behavior seem to tell a different story?
Yes.
Yes, good. Appreciate the affirmation, Peter. Indeed. The case of Moshe, I'd like to suggest, says Rabbi Foreman, forces upon us the notion that the Torah defines humility differently from the way Merriam-Webster does. And in order to see how this is so, I'd like to speculate with you for a moment about a tantalizing possibility. Maybe the two things that make Moshe utterly unique are not two separate things at all. We saw earlier that Moshe has this uncanny ability to withstand sustained direct contact with the divine. His ability to speak to God face to face is unparalleled. Also, according to the Torah, Moshe has another unique quality. He happens to be the most humble man who ever walked the earth. So maybe it wasn't a coincidence that Moshe just happened to exhibit these two qualities in their extreme form. Maybe these two qualities are really somehow two facets of the same thing. A further indication that this might be so comes from the text of this week's Parsha. Because it just so happens, right, and I think it's on purpose that he's only given us parenthetical references instead of quoting kind of block text straight at us yet, because it just so happens that these two unique things about Moshe both show up in a single particular episode in this week's Parsha. Let me show you what I mean. Toward the end of Parshat Beha'alotcha, that's our Parsha, Miriam and Aharon speak about their brother Moshe, seemingly behind his back. They complain that he seems to act differently from other prophets. Their words are quoted by the Torah. Right, the context here is their discussion about the Cushite woman that Moshe has taken, but that's incidental for Rabbi Foreman here. He wants to focus in on kind of their underlying concern. Harak ach b'Moshe diber Hashem. Did God speak only with Moses? Did God not speak with us as well? Vayishma Hashem, and God heard. Now, right after this, the text gets to that point, right? That was Numbers chapter 12, verse 2. Now we're going to the next verse. Right after this, the text gets to that point about Moshe's humility. It tells us, as an aside to the reader, that V'ha'ish Moshe anav me'od mikol ha'adam asher al pnei ha'adama. Now the man Moshe was very humble, more than any other person on the face of the earth. Following this little aside, the text tells us that God goes and calls to Miriam and Aharon and rebukes them for their words. And in the process of doing so, the text touches on that second point we were talking about, Moshe's uniqueness among the prophets. And God said, this is to Miriam and Aharon, hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, will make myself known to him in a vision and will speak to him in a dream. It is not so with my servant Moshe. In all my house he is faithful. Face to face will I speak with him, and in a clear vision and not with riddles, right? Meaning the way I interact with the typical prophet is a vision or a dream. But with Moshe, it's face to face, this seemingly awake state, clear vision, no riddles. Now let's analyze these events a little bit. And I, Rabbi Foreman, want to show you why I think these two aspects of Moshe's character might be connected. Let's say I asked you, what was the purpose of that little aside in the middle of the story we just read about Moshe being the most humble man to walk the earth? Why exactly did the Torah feel compelled to pause its retelling of events and provide the reader with this little background information about Moshe? Why mention Moshe's humility here? Why tell it to us now? The way I always read the story, I'll confess to you, is that the Torah was explaining to the reader why Moshe didn't speak up for himself when Aaron and Miriam were saying disparaging things about him. He didn't feel it was his place. He was really a modest fellow, and therefore he didn't say anything in his own defense. So God ended up coming to Moshe's aid with a rhetorical broadside against Miriam and Aaron, because Moshe was so loath to defend himself. Right? Let's just go back and review the psukim. They say in chapter 12, verse 2, Did God not speak with us as well? And God heard. And then it says, now Moshe was very humble. And then it goes on and says, just a couple of verses later, after it says that God summoned them to the tent of meeting, and God said, Moshe is my faithful one, right? So what Rabbi Foreman is saying is he understands it that they speak ill of Moshe. Moshe doesn't speak up. The text just tells us why is Moshe silent? Because he's humble. He doesn't want to he doesn't want to self-promote in this moment. And for him, even self-defending is self-promoting. So he's silent, and God speaks up on his behalf. That seems, Rabbi Foreman continues, like a reasonable interpretation. But here's the problem with it. Right after Miriam and Moshe speak to Miriam, that should be Aharon, right?
Aaron.
Right after Miriam and Aharon, it should say, speak disparagingly about Moshe, the text adds a seemingly superfluous couple of words. Harak ach b'Moshe diber Hashem, halo gam banu diber. Did God speak only with Moshe? Did God not speak with us as well? Vayishma Hashem, and God heard. Now he asks a good question. Why does the text go out of its way to tell us this? God, of course, sees and hears everything. It therefore seems utterly superfluous for the text to tell us that God overheard what Miriam and Aharon were saying. Unless perhaps the text is actually telling us something else by way of implication. In other words, it is telling us that God heard, but someone else didn't hear. And who would that someone else have been? It would have to have been Moshe. In other words, the text is telling us that only the omniscient God was aware of Miriam and Aharon's words. Moshe, on the other hand, was unaware of what his sister and brother were saying about him. Miriam and Aharon weren't criticizing Moshe in broad daylight. They were whispering about Moshe to each other. They were speaking secretly. So if Moshe was really unaware of what they were saying, let's revisit the question I asked you about the need for that little narrative aside. Why does the Torah smack in the middle of this episode feel compelled to tell us that Moshe was so surpassingly humble? It can't be to explain why Moshe didn't rise in his own defense. He didn't rise in his own defense because he didn't hear what his siblings were saying about him. It must be that the reason the Torah mentions Moshe's humility at this point isn't to explain to the reader what just happened, why Moshe remained silent, why he didn't stand up for himself in the face of criticism from his siblings, right? Because he wasn't there, he didn't hear it. Maybe the point is to explain to the reader the following event, what was about to happen next in the text. And what happens next is that God declares to Aaron and Miriam that Moshe's kind of prophecy is unique. In other words, the purpose of the aside is to give you, the reader, insight into the engine that drove Moshe's unique capacity as a prophet to encounter God face to face. Why was it that Moshe had this capacity to communicate directly with God in a way that was clear and unencumbered? Why could he survive a direct and unfettered encounter with God when other prophets couldn't? What was so different about Moshe? That engine, the text is telling us, was the quality of humility. Moshe was surpassingly humble. The two things that Moshe possessed in extreme, an ability to prophesy with unparalleled clarity and extreme humility, are in fact just two sides of the same coin. But now the question is, why should it be that way? Why is it that one's level of prophecy, one's ability to withstand a direct encounter with God, is influenced so profoundly by one's humility of all things? Well, it turns out that the Torah might well be trying to explain this very thing to us. Listen how, in the very next verse, God continues and explains to Miriam and Aaron why Moshe's unique ability to prophesy is so different. The Almighty doesn't just say as a blind fact that Moshe is different. God says something about where that special God says something about where that special quality comes from. That explanation takes the form of an unusual descriptor that God attaches to Moshe. Lo chen avdi Moshe, it's not so with my servant Moshe. B'chol beiti ne'emanhu. In all of my house, he is faithful. A faithful servant. That's what God calls Moshe here. The text seems to tell us that being a faithful servant, whatever that means, is the key. It's the essential quality needed to experience the ultimate depths of prophecy. Why? What is faithful service, ne'eman, all about? It may be a little abstract to wrap your mind around things like prophecy, direct communication with the Almighty, and being a servant of God. So, might I suggest that we try our hand at a terrestrial analogy? Imagine an earthly ruler and his servant. At the risk of seeming a bit whimsical, I'll actually refer you to a fictionalized account of a contemporary ruler and his servant. The relationship between the President of the United States and his valet, as characterized on Aaron Sorkin's television series The West Wing. Now's the time where I confess that I haven't seen The West Wing, even though it was so popular for so long. So I feel like I have to at least watch one episode that features this relationship. In The West Wing, President Bartlett is an imposing figure. Many people with big resumes and even bigger egos are attracted to his orbit. But the one person who gains the most direct access to him, the one person on his staff who quite literally is trusted in the president's whole house, right? That's a paraphrase of our verse, what God says, B'chol beiti ne'aman, who trusted in my whole house, who can enter the presidential bedroom and wake Martin Sheen up from a nap, is not any of those big resume people. It's a young man by the name of Charlie. Charlie has no resume of note. He's an orphan. His mother was a police officer killed in the line of duty, and he stayed home from college to help raise his sister. No Ivy League glamour here. Charlie has no guile, and he's not a social climber. For Charlie, working in the White House wasn't a resume builder. It wasn't about him. He was there to serve, faithfully. And it was this that gave him a kind of proximity to the president that no one else could possibly have. Bottom line, when you are around ultimate power, whether it is the most powerful man on earth, the US president, or whether it is the King of Kings in heaven, your own ego can work against you. It can impede your level of access. Sure, a modest share of ego is fine for regular folks. Everyone wants to get ahead in life, right? A smattering of ego is fine for doctors and carpenters and lawyers and bus drivers. But that same basic sense of ego is somehow dangerous around God. Standing in the presence of the master of the universe is too overwhelming an experience for a mortal human being to withstand if there is any part of you that thinks this is about you. An encounter with God is survivable only if you are entirely there to serve, only if you are entirely transparent. That really is the soul of humility. Understanding that at the end of the day, whoever you are and whatever you achieve, it isn't really about you. Your contributions don't entitle you to privilege, fame, or honor. On the contrary, you deem it a privilege to be able to serve. The significance of the work that you do isn't the glory that attaches itself to that work, or the congratulations you receive for it. The significance of your work is the work itself. Recognition is really beside the point. All of which helps us focus, I think, on what humility is and what it isn't. Humility doesn't mean I'm a pushover. It doesn't mean I can't stand up to power. It doesn't mean I don't recognize my talents or the value of my contributions to the world. In some ways, the very opposite is true. I so deeply recognize the value of my contributions and my own unique ability to make them that I will not let myself be fooled into thinking that those contributions have as their prime purpose something much smaller, the aggrandizement of little old me. Because my service is of supreme value, and I am just the transparent vessel through which it comes into the world. I think we are in a position now to reconsider the mystery I mentioned earlier. Why is it that most mortals would die when encountering the master of the universe face to face? But somehow, Moshe can encounter God at Sinai and live through that experience. Stop and think about why it is actually so dangerous to encounter God. What is it about this experience that is so challenging to human existence? We often think of God as such an imposing presence, such a powerful force, that we humans are all but washed away by the force of an encounter with God. But what if somehow the reverse were true? What if the toxicity of an encounter with God comes not from the immensity of God's presence, but paradoxically from the opposite of this, God's extreme nothingness? To explain, God is the being who lives in a world beyond space and time. You can't see God or touch God. God lacks physical substance, even physical dimension. So ironically, when this most powerful of beings comes into our world, from the standpoint of our human mode of existence, God really shows up as nothing at all. We humans measure presence in terms of the space you take up, the time you occupy. We speak of inches and feet, meters and kilometers, seconds, hours, and minutes. Paradoxically, While God is the most powerful being we can possibly imagine, by the measures of our space, time and space-bound world, God is also the closest to absolute nothingness that can possibly be imagined. Kabbalistically, this paradox of God's presence beyond space and time registers as Ein Sof, literally endlessness, an aspect of what us moderns might call infinitude. Now, stay with that thought a minute and muse with me. Aside from God, do we ever encounter this paradox elsewhere? The world of modern physics would tell us that there does exist a phenomenon that expresses precisely that paradoxical relationship. It is a black hole. A black hole is both immensely powerful and, from the standpoint of time and space, it is just about as close as you can get to nothing in this universe of ours. The extreme nothingness, so to speak, of a black hole consumes literally everything, all matter and energy in its proximity. Nothing can survive an encounter with a black hole. The above is obviously only an analogy, but maybe an analogy can be made between the physical aspects of our universe and aspects of its spiritual dimensions. Maybe something like this is true about God. When God, a being devoid of space and time, somehow comes into our world of space and time, the power of God's presence likewise destroys all somethings in the vicinity. What then could survive in God's presence? Perhaps only a similarly extreme version of nothing, which accounts maybe for why it is that extreme humility is the one quality one must possess to survive a divine encounter. An extremely humble person nullifies their own ego, their own sense of self-importance, and in so doing, they become the nothing, the completely transparent being that can withstand the extreme nothingness of the divine without injury. Almost there. It's a lot to wrap our brains around and to digest, and we also might not agree. I'll share a thought about it at the end, but let's try to make our way all the way through. The power that comes in the wake of the diminishment of ego should not be underestimated. One sees it fittingly enough with Moshe himself. In his entire career as leader of the people of Israel, what would you say was Moshe's most powerful moment? Personally, I'd say it was in the immediate aftermath of the people's worship of the golden calf. The moment Moshe stood up to the master of the universe, God's self, when God sought to destroy the people. At that point, God had made an offer to Moshe of ultimate aggrandizement. I will destroy everyone and start over with you. And Moshe turns down the offer. Not only does he say no, but his actions at that moment have such force that they actually change the direction of history. They change God's plan. God backs down on God's threat to destroy everyone. And how does Moshe achieve it? Well, listen to his words, repeating what we said at the passage we quoted at the beginning. Moshe went back to God and said, "This people has committed a terrible sin. They have made themselves gods of gold. And now if you will bear their sin, but if not, erase me from your book that you have written." Think about what Moshe did here. Ironically, even deliciously, he leveraged his own nothingness. At the moment Moshe most fully internalized the truth that it wasn't really about him, at that moment he achieved his greatest power. He created a metamorphosis in the direction of the divine plan itself. God selects Moshe because he is the most humble man to have walked the earth. But in doing so, God wasn't selecting a patsy or a yes man. He was selecting someone who would have the potential for immense power. That power can be described in esoteric terms, the language of infinity, exploding stars, and black holes. But ultimately, it is a power that we can all harness to some extent or another in our own lives. It is the power that comes from an understanding that it is not all about me. So, this concept that he's really describing here, and I'm surprised he doesn't mention it more explicitly, is often referred to in Hasidic literature as bitul hayesh, the abolishing, the eradication of the self.
Self-abnegation.
Yes, self-abnegation. Yes, and maybe it's just my ego speaking, but I find it hard to swallow. Um, of course, like the proportionality of the self is important, and the recognition that I like the way he articulates it, that our contributions, our service is so valuable that we don't want to shrink it down to the smallness of ourselves. But I think the danger of getting all the way to the abnegation of the self, to becoming nothingness, to becoming transparent, to me, just it seems that then it's so hard to actually do anything in the world because one has to harness some sense of themselves in order
Mhm.
to pour their energy, their again, it's not about us, but we are beings and we have to harness some sense of our selfhood to, I think, to achieve. Again, it doesn't have to be focused on ego, but we have to know ourselves. We have to draw on ourselves to do whatever it is that we're doing out in the world. So, you know, there are few people that could make a more compelling case from my perspective than Rabbi Foreman. I find sometimes, yeah, as I've said here before, I think his rhetoric, his style is a little over the top. Um, but I love the way he reads. You know, of course, there's so many more dimensions to Moshe. His anger issues, you know, it's not there. He's a more complex character than I think he's being presented here, where he's focusing on just these two dimensions, the prophetic strength and the humility and their relationship. There's a lot more dimensions to Moshe than just that. But all of that said, there's something really profound, I think, in what he's describing. I love the sense of God as nothingness in a way, as we encounter God in the world, and the need to sort of have a nothingness of self in order to meet God. Um, but I have like there's like a some limit for me in how far one takes this argument. Maybe the point, you know, my parents are on, and I've commented in a few settings that my father often, you know, pointed out to me that we don't bless our children to be like Moshe. You know, we bless our children to be like Ephraim and Menashe. There's a different place where we say, you know, Abraham should be a blessing, and Rashi comments that we should bless our children to be like Abraham. But Moshe, he is otherworldly. He is unreachable. So maybe this argument is true about Moshe, and we're not actually meant to even try to approximate Moshe, maybe to draw something from the lesson of Moshe, to shift our perspective a little bit, but not to aspire or imagine that we could land where Moshe is. And so there's something to take from it, but it's not all that you know, not applicable in its fullness to our lives. But I still find it a, you know, a beautiful textual reading, um, and you know, and certainly plenty to learn from it. So as you could see, it provokes a response from me, this notion of the self-abnegation. So thanks for hearing that response. Just appreciating Leela's comment in the chat. The amazing movie Interstellar collapses space and time to show love as a force transcending it. And at the center of this movie is a black hole that the protagonist has to travel through. So there's, yes, continuity of that theme. And, you know, it's to Rabbi Foreman's credit. We've seen him quote, you know, philosophers and artists, and here, you know, drawing from astronomy, because examples from our frame of reference, cultural references, you know, do help illustrate the Torah, which is meant to be accessible, but sometimes is esoteric. So, um, in any event, pausing for any thoughts or comments before we wrap up.
Uh, I have a question.
Please, Peter.
I wonder what in Moshe's life led to his development of self-abnegation. Was this his first meeting at the burning bush, or what was there must have been an evolution. Persons are not born being humble.
Yeah.
Is there a specific time, or is it just a set of events?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. But it's so um my I have two responses, just briefly. One is that I think the rabbis, broadly speaking, I know this is, a very general reaction, because of how mystical and magical Moshe is as a character, because he encounters God in this unique way. I think the rabbis evade that question and actually imagine him as born, born with something, right? Think about the Midrashim about the room filled with light when Moshe was born and all these wondrous things he already did as an infant. Um, and so I think for them, maybe because it's so hard to answer the question, they resort to sort of the sense that it's not in his biography; it's already inborn.
Built in, yeah.
Um, because I think, just to say a second point, narratively, I think it's a really interesting question. He acts in the world more like a normal human being with the flaws and challenges that a normal human being has. And so we have these sort of two, Moshe, the character who is like a regular human being, and Moshe who seems otherworldly, right? And V'zot HaBracha opens Asher Beirach Moshe Ish HaElohim at Bnei Israel, man of God. And there's some amazing midrashim there that talk about he was, if you could imagine such a thing, half man and half God. It was with the top half was God and bottom half was man, and the rabbis wrestle with this notion. So, um, it feels so hard to develop a biographical reading of him in the real world that could explain these extraordinary characteristics. But that is also to say that I don't, they push against that otherworldliness. So I think it's a great question. Yeah, yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. All right. Wonderful to be with everyone. Thanks for joining to learn. Let me take a moment to check my calendar for next week, assuming all is smooth and well. Shira's overseas for a few days, so finishing up bedtime here ran a little later. Um, Next Monday night, I hope to be with my mom and dad at SAR High School for their eldest grandchild's graduation, my niece Meital. So we'll again defer to Tuesday, and given the lateness of the Mincha Maariv hour, we'll be at our latest time of 9 o'clock. So we'll be 9 o'clock next Tuesday. For those who are able to keep their eyes open, and we'll go to there and continue making our way through Bamidbar. So thanks to all. Great to be
Thank you.
together. Good
Thank
night,
you.
everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Laila Tov.
Laila tov. Laila tov. Bye bye.